if you have a look on Docker Hub, there's a lot more repositories that you can actually, or images that you can actually access. Pretty much anything you can think of. So if you want databases, there's all sorts of different MySQL or Postgres images that you can use. We're going to use a couple of these in a little while, so we can have a look at spinning up some databases. But there's also web servers, yeah, pretty much, and way more. Like if you can think of an application that's out there, you can probably find an image for it on Docker Hub, yeah. As you can see down the left-hand side in terms of the categories, there's messaging systems, there's monitoring systems, there's different setups for programming languages and storage and security. There's Windows images, which we'll talk about in a second. So there's a whole bunch, but there's one in here that I want to use which is an Apache image, yeah, this Clover Apache image. Now, one thing to realize before we get into Clover Apache is that with most of these images up here, you can actually see the Docker file that was used to create it. So just like we created Docker files to create our images, these images have also been mostly based off Docker files, yeah. And you can see here, you know, there's more commands. We've looked at very few of the commands in it, but the core ones are the ones we've looked at. You know, there's a from statement where they're specifying what image they're using as their base. And then there's one or more run statements, which are basically all of the things they're doing to change this image from its base. Yeah. So we're going to use this Clover Apache image. Yeah. And now I haven't used it on this machine before, so when we actually go to pull it down, we should see it pulling it down from Docker Hub. Yeah. So like we saw before, we want to say Docker container run, okay, and in a second I'll give it the name Clover Apache. This is a web server, so there's probably two additional things that we will want to do with this. Now, number one, it's a web server, so it wants to serve up HTML files and other things to the internet, yeah. So we probably want to point it at some HTML files and CSS files and images and all the other things that we want to use. Maybe we're using this to test our website, yeah, as our local test instance before we push it up to our production Apache instance, yeah. So we might have a local directory, which is where we're developing all of our HTML and our CSS and whatever else. And using the volumes technique that we saw a second ago, we can map that local directory with our HTML file into a directory inside that Clover Apache container. Yeah. So if we have a look, I've got I'll do it over here. What's working directory? If I come out of that local volume directory and have a look, I've got a directory here. Sorry, trying to do too many things at once. I've got a directory here called webroot, and if we have a look inside that webroot directory, it's got a file called index.html, and inside index.html is just some really super bare bones HTML. Yeah, could easily be lots more complicated than this, and other images and CSS files and whatever else you want. Yeah, but here's my web files that I want to test. Yeah, so the first thing that I probably want to do is use the volume, the -v command that we saw a second ago, to map that local directory, which is my home directory, documents, demos, Docker, webroot, I think. Yeah. Map that into a particular folder inside my container. Now, because this container is an Apache container, I can map it into var www. So the contents of my webroot will replace that var/www folder inside my container. Yeah, so that's great. The other thing that a web server does typically is listen on a network port. Yeah. Listen for web requests coming, HTTP requests coming in on a particular port, and then replies to them. Yeah. Now, we saw before, you may not have really noticed, but we saw before when we were doing this docker container list command, we were starting up these containers, and the ports column here was empty. They weren't listening on any ports. By default, your containers don't have access to sort of the outside internet. You've got to specify what ports are going to be available to your containers. Yeah. And this is kind of like we did with the volumes. With the volumes, we said, here's this local folder, and I'm going to map it into this named folder inside the container. Well, the ports are the same. What I'm going to say is that here's a local port on my Mac, in my case, and I'm going to map it into this particular named port inside the container. Yeah. So here, we don't use -v for this because -v is for volumes. Instead, what we can use is -p for ports. So if I say -p, I need to give it a local port, yeah, on my Mac. So I'm going to say 8086, just because I'm old. So my local port 8086, and I want to map that into port 80 inside my inside this Apache container. So in the browser, I'm going to hit port 8086, but that'll be translated into whatever Apache internally in the container is listening on port 80. So it'll map that into that. Okay. Now before we still have, so that we've got Docker container run -v for my volume, -p for my ports. That's a new bit. And then before we said -it, and then the name of the image. Yeah. We used -it before because we wanted an interactive session. Yeah, I was starting up the bash shell, and so I wanted to be able to type into it. I wanted to be able to interact with it. Here, my interaction is going to be through the browser, not through the terminal session. So I don't really want to start up an interactive session through this terminal, through this command prompt. Yeah. So instead of -it, I'm going to do -dit. -d basically tells it to start this in the background or as a daemon on Linux. Yeah. So what this means is when I do this, well, let's actually do it. Okay. Can't find the Clover Apache image locally. It's going to pull it down from Docker Hub so we can see it downloading. Okay. Grabbing all of the images. Okay. It's got them. Okay. Started them up. Yeah. But it's given me back my Mac OS prompt. That's because I told it to start as a -d, as a daemon, start in the background. If we're not sure if this is actually running, let's come back here and say, what was it? Docker container list. We can still see there that I've got my container running. Yeah. It's Clover Apache. Yeah. Started 24 seconds ago. And now, importantly, we've got it listening on a few different ports. In my case, it's listening on the internal port in the container is port 80, but I've got port 8086 mapped to that. Yeah. Now, a couple of things, but first let's try and hit this in the browser and see what we get. Yeah. So let's come back out to my browser, and it's going to be localhost 8086. Is that right? Yeah. Hello from Docker. If you remember, that was what was in here. And what this means is while I've got this running, often if you do any web development, especially with a remote server, it can be quite painful. You have to edit your files locally, FTP them up to the server, jump over to your browser, test them. You've made some stupid mistake, jump back down to your local version, edit it again, FTP it up to the server again, drives you mad. Yeah. But because we've got Apache running in a container, and I've mapped a local folder into that, I can just make changes locally, whatever stupid changes I want to make, save them, and immediately come over and refresh my page. Yeah, so all my changes are available immediately. So that's kind of cool, I think. What else could we do? There we go. You can tell I'm not a yeehaw web developer. Let's put some other text in here. Refresh. Yeah, we're away. Yeah, so in terms of shortening the development cycle, Docker, this is one of the big things that I use Docker for, is shortening that developer cycle so that I don't have to muck around with FTP connections and remote servers and all that sort of business. I can edit my files locally, I can test them, but equally I can test them in the production using the same system that production's going to use. Yeah, I don't have to run some pretend local web server and then hope that it behaves the same way under Apache. I can run Apache, the exact same version of Apache that we're going to run in production. Yeah, but I can run it in a container locally and do my development locally, have much higher confidence that it's going to work when I run it in the same Apache on the remote server. Yeah. Okay, but a couple more things. Yeah. So that's great. That's ports. And just to ram that home, that was the -p command. Port 80 inside the container was mapped to port 8086 outside the container. Yeah. But as is often the case with this, we've got a web server here, but let's say there's an error inside Apache, something that I've configured incorrectly or whatever. I'm not getting any output here to see why it's failing. Yeah, so it's pretty common that I want to be able to look at the logs for the process that's running inside the container. I could log into the container, I could get a shell into the container and go looking for it, but there's another way that I can do it as well. The Docker command itself gives me a way to say Docker container logs. We need to give it the ID of the container, but that's just this guy here. Yeah, so we can borrow that. Let me copy that. Docker container logs. There's the ID. Okay, and I'll just do -f. So we can now see all of the logs in real time from that Apache container. So as I interact with it through the browser or have my Apache module running and maybe throw exceptions or whatever else, I can have a terminal window open and see in real time the Apache log coming up. Okay, makes sense? So like I said, you could get an interactive session into your container and do that, but going through the Docker command itself is kind of nice because you can do this for any of them. If you're also in the background running a MySQL container, you can jump in and have a look at the logs in that in real time as well.